Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SSHRC, or Carleton University.
Okay, well, good morning everyone. Je profite aussi de l'occasion de vous saluer en français. Venant de l'Université de Lausanne, être au Canada, c'est toujours un plaisir. On vient d'un pays trilingue où certainement on connaît tous les avantages et les désavantages d'avoir plusieurs langues. Mais donc ça fait toujours plaisir et une espèce de solidarité entre Suisses et Canadiens. I'd like to thank Armand for having me, not for the first time. I think we have had, maybe because of this, a long-standing cooperation on the relationship between Europe and Canada, so it's a pleasure to be back. It's great to be back here in Ottawa, and I say this now because I think it will help you maybe to understand how I present certain things. My first visit to Ottawa was many years ago when I came as a negotiator, as a trade and investment negotiator for the Swiss government, negotiating an agreement between Canada and Switzerland in the wake, we can say, of the ongoing or coming negotiations between the European Union and Canada. So that was many years ago, and it's of course interesting to listen to what Ljiljana just said and what we will be saying this morning and discussing this morning, what the ambassador said, to see what has happened in these last 10, 15 years and what is going to happen. And that is maybe now taking me to my topic here, which is maybe Armand organized it this way in a quite fitting way. Ljiljana showed you a bit of where we are now in view of what happened in Europe, the early days of European integration, the internal market, of NAFTA in the 1990s. I just talked about the negotiations in the 1990s. And now we are here in 2016 looking at CETA, and I would like to take you even one step further, taking you to TTIP, which is already in the room and which is having already strong implications of what is happening with CETA, what has just happened. Others will talk more about the investment chapter. That is, of course, a very good example where a negotiated agreement basically has been changed, I would say, at the very last moment because the world is not standing still. It's going on. And you can see this also now with TTIP for other countries. Just to give you some insights, I was at a meeting in Geneva last week, and up came one of the Swiss negotiators who is doing this now, as I'm no longer doing it, and said, "Oh, you're going to Canada. Yeah, of course, we are also talking to the Canadians. We have to talk to them now. We have this existing agreement, but of course now it's being overtaken by everything that's happening, including TTIP, so we have to renegotiate." So you see how dynamic, of course, this environment is. So let me talk to you for a moment now more on the European Union's common commercial policy, as it used to be called. But even now, when you go to the website, even they have changed the language, and they call it now their trade and investment, economic relations with the world, and how it affects the relations with Canada. That's the topic for today. But of course, how it is affected by what is happening globally. And that's maybe the state of play that I want to talk about. I would then like to focus very much on the expected benefits. So this new approach, Armand said, we're talking now about mega regionals, but that basically alludes to the fact that we have very big actors and groups negotiating here. So it's more a quantitative approach. But then Armand has also said it, and Ljiljana has hinted at it, we are also talking about a new type of negotiations. This being necessary, as many of the things we've done in the past have come to an end. There is not so much we can do there. So if we want to add benefits, we have to do more. And that means it's also slightly more complicated. Then, what are the difficulties? Already when I talk about the benefits, many of you here in the room will probably immediately think of, but this is not, is this positive in the first place? Or is this also negative, or is it mostly negative? And that is, of course, then what I would like to look at here. And the other thing is then to come back maybe to what I've started out with. The United States and European Union negotiating TTIP, this affects a lot of people, not only in those two entities, but also outside. And so the impact it has on third countries, and here in particular Canada, or for example for me Switzerland, is particularly felt in those countries that have traditionally close relationships with these two. Now it has been said, I have it here in my slides just because I don't know how familiar everyone is, but I'll be more relatively quick with this introductory part. The EU has now a comprehensive mandate to negotiate trade and investment, and that has not always been the case. And so we see, of course, also, especially on the side of the European Union, that some of the initial problems and some of the hiccups and some of the debates are very much related to the fact that in some areas the EU is new to the game. That doesn't mean they don't know a lot about it, because of course the people working there have been studying and working on this for a long time, but the common EU position on some things had to evolve and will still have to evolve in the future. And that is giving sometimes a particular color to some of the things that are happening. But now it's an exclusive power. It covers now trading goods, services, intellectual property, and foreign direct investment, to name but only the core issues. We will see we have now also new issues like competition policy, like regulatory cooperation in other fields, sustainable development, consumer protection, that is also in there. And that makes it then really quite complicated to negotiate. And if you go, I will show you that in a moment, if you go to the press releases by the United States and the European Union, you can see that it is very time consuming. And so they're really negotiating for long hours because there is so much to discuss. That is one of the downsides, of course, also of these mega regionals. How can you, as a negotiator, in the end, bring that all together? And you can only do that, of course, by then compromising on some issues and really finding your priorities. And that may affect then also the outcome of these agreements. You don't need this. For those who are more interested in knowing more about the European Union, the ambassador has done this already. The European Union is also, of course, like any country negotiating these things on the home front. You have to tell also your own people why you're doing this and that you're doing it in a good way for your constituency. This Trade for All initiative is the European Union's way to present this as a concept to the outside world. And so I can only recommend, if you're interested in this, you go to the European Union's homepage, you find this. It's a nice document, sometimes, of course, a bit political. As a lawyer, you sometimes feel, okay, yes, you can say it this way, but this is not really the problem. But of course, it's a political process also. Now, state of play. The European Union, as Canada, as Switzerland, as the United States, these are not easy times for a politician. Globalization is going on, leading to a fragmentation of the value chains. So we're all industry, business in all these countries is struggling and wants new solutions, sees that existing patterns are changing and therefore wants the framework, the legal framework, to adapt. There are new important players. Ljiljana has mentioned China, Brazil and India. Brazil may not be doing so well right now, but it's still there, of course. And so these are players we have to take into account. India, of course, is growing quickly. And so the old world, as some would call it, and this is then not only Europe, but it's sometimes used in the United States, but let's say the traditional OECD countries, to use one, maybe one connecting element, they feel under pressure. And so it makes sense, of course, for them to say, we have to move quickly in the WTO, Ljiljana made allusion to that, it's obviously not possible. Now, as much as we regret it, that's at least what everybody says, then let's do it bilaterally, regionally, and the more impact it has on our economy, the better. We owe this to our industry. The current economic situation, especially in Europe, adds, of course, to the pressure. And the ambassador, of course, made a reference to this. There is a strong feeling that to get out of the crisis, foreign economic relations are one of the ways to take ourselves out of the crisis. And we need the rest of the world. Europe needs the rest of the world to help it to overcome this crisis. And we have traditionally been very good at this, and we hope to be still good at it. But for that, we need market access to partner countries. Well, these figures, and so they're in the slides, so if someone is interested, you can certainly get those later. Why is it so important for Europe? Europe depends heavily on foreign investment and foreign trade relations. This has been so, I was going to say forever, well, since the 19th century, basically. You can show that this has happened again and again. This makes, for many countries, this makes it very important. I can talk for Switzerland, which is a very typical European country in this respect. The wealth is basically made up by its access to foreign markets. And on both sides, inputs, the ambassador mentioned energy. We are heavily dependent, but then also on outputs. And so this brings us back to why these type of agreements, why CETA, why the TTIP are so important. Here are more figures, you don't need them. Europe is always very highly located. Ljiljana mentioned then that the development, and so this is the state of play seen from the European Union, basically trying to have preferential agreements with everyone. Now this is of course now the bizarre thing. If you have preferential agreements with everyone, that doesn't make sense. Now you see still there is, many of them are not yet in place. Many of them are old, so as colorful as this map looks, if you look at each agreement, you see of course that some of them are outdated. And I spoke about the existing agreement between Canada and Switzerland. It took a very long time to negotiate. Everybody was quite relieved when it finally was coming into force, but now it's already outdated. That doesn't mean that we don't need it. It's good to have it, but it's no longer up to date. So quickly you have to move forwards and renegotiate. So it's a constant dynamic process. TTIP, European Union, United States, started officially in 2013, and just, what is that now, 10 days ago, 3 weeks ago, the last round in Brussels, the 12th round. For those of you who have not negotiated such agreements, this is actually quite a heavy rhythm. Huh? You go to these meetings. This means you have to prepare weeks before what you want to do. Then you have a few days. These are very long meetings, usually in rooms like this, I must say. And then you go back with a lot of homework, already preparing the next one. So basically, you only do this. So this is quite a heavy rhythm, you can say. The conclusion is hoped for in 2016. Now, how realistic this is, also with the elections, everybody's discussing this. But you see, of course, it's important to keep the momentum. You need to keep the pressure to make it happen, because we will know in the end there will be important compromises, and I've mentioned that before. Now, what makes it so new and so challenging? Well, some things are the same. Here you have an overview about the goals, but I'll immediately go to the more detailed view, because that makes it then more interesting. When it comes to market access, the process here is presented this time as market access, regulatory competition, and some other issues. Traditionally, I would say, to simplify a bit, we discussed only market access. And when Ljiljana talked about NAFTA, there was very much this idea, we open the markets, we liberalize. And that worked in the 90s, and it works no longer now, for the good reason being, it is already quite open, at least among the actors we talk about here, between Canada and the EU, between the United States and the EU, between Canada and Switzerland. So if we want to now to go further, and I just explained why we have to, we need more. And this we can basically only do through what they call now regulatory cooperation. It's just something you see always for those who are in economics or in economic international relations. Once you eliminate major obstacles like tariffs, you then need common standards. And basically that always means either mutual recognition, you do it your way, I do it my way, it's fine, or you harmonize. Now harmonization is then usually when we talk about, okay, harmonization means a law. We adopt new rules. And then it comes in what was also mentioned in the introduction today, democratic legitimacy, who adopts these laws, how sovereign are we in the future to change them again. That makes it usually much, much more difficult and needs much, much closer cooperation. And the European Union knows something about this. If you look at the internal history, that's what we have seen over 30 years, and it's still difficult. So it makes it even more difficult, of course, then at a global level, even if it's just transatlantic or transpacific. Now, if you see this here, when it comes to goods, I would say not too new. You see here tariffs, especially that. That's also, the negotiations are sometimes now criticized, saying, okay, but the tariffs are already so low, why do you still go through this dangerous process if it adds so little? Well, one must say for some industries, these average figures are of course always misleading. For some industries it makes a real difference, so they still have problems. For others it doesn't count at all. But of course, this is normal. When it comes to services, there is still more room because we are at an earlier stage in global history of services liberalization. And this is also true between Canada and the European Union, between Canada and Switzerland. There is still more areas that we can open, so it's still more a traditional approach. Recognition of professional qualifications, you find it here. There, of course, you can say this goes already into regulatory cooperation. If you recognize whether an engineering diploma is sufficient or not, you basically have to recognize the equivalency, or you have to have common standards. So in principle, we are already in the new field, though it's still presented here as something that has been around for a longer time. That's probably the reason. You find it already in the WTO text of 1995. So it's at least 20 years old on the global level, but it already here, it is more difficult because you have this cooperation. Public procurement, maybe aside, we can talk about that later. That's maybe the one area of market access, the traditional area where we still have room for maneuver. Now we come to this famous regulatory cooperation that also in the discussions is usually put forward. And I said also, this is probably the new dimension. Now, I've also just said it's not totally new, but there is more of it now. And it's therefore more complicated. And it's also more important to have the debate with civil society and politicians on how to deal with it. Now, you see here, that's where we expect the highest potential of economic benefits, hoping that it will lead to convergence, thereby eliminating obstacles and thereby allowing for more growth through more trade. How could this be achieved? One is very careful, so it's very much about this debate. And in the CETA agreement, although it's already there, if you then look at it as a lawyer, as a trade lawyer, I must say we are at a really early stage. Not to say that this is not difficult already, but if you say, of course, okay, we inform each other early that we're going to change our regulation, we give the other side a chance to say us what they think about it. That doesn't mean you have common rules in the end. But it's a beginning. And even this is already difficult because you talk then to stakeholders in Brussels who, for example, have an interest in a regulation in a particular area. I've just been at the German Chemicals Association in Brussels. They have, of course, very concrete ideas on what they want to see changed for their market access. And they say, yes, for us, being in the process early makes a difference. So yes, it is a beginning, but it's just the beginning. When it then comes to other areas, I just give maybe 2-3 examples, and it also, I think, it comes nicely in with what Ljiljana presented. this is then also where the fears come from. TBT and SPS, so technical obstacles to trade, or technical barriers to trade. That's, for example, the question on certain conformity assessments. Most people follow it then when it comes to such conformity assessments or standards, when it comes to health, to food, or maybe cosmetics, because most of us can have more of an idea that what they eat may affect their life than that the chair on which they are sitting could also break down. And so that's also then, of course, where most of the NGOs and civil society comes in. The examples often discussed are oysters, for example. Why can't Europe export any oysters to the United States? Well, because there are different ways of testing them. On one side, you test the oysters as such, and on the others, you just test the water in which the oysters have been. Now, scientifically, you can show that both lead to the exactly same result. You basically prove that there is some bacteria are not around, and even if the bacteria is in the water, you can usually be sure that it's also in the oysters. But that is a typical example. Now, the question and the problem, of course, is, do people accept that? Or do they say, we have our traditions here, so we need to live with them? And that is in the hiccups here. That's probably where, at the home front, both sides will have their major problems, and I hope we can discuss this morning. Now, what I wanted to say is, of course, this regulatory cooperation takes also place in other areas, and for example, in services. And in services, it will probably in the future be much more important. But again, for the time being, it's maybe a bit more technical. Not too many people are too familiar with all the prudential rules in financial services, for example. But there it will make, of course, the major difference. And there it is already happening to a certain extent. If you think what has happened with FATCA or with cooperation between banks and tax authorities in the last 5 years, that's exactly this. It's regulatory cooperation in the services sector. It's just being done for the time being in a different setting, the OECD. So you have to see there also the larger picture. Now, to conclude, all this means the negotiations are complicated. It means that the negotiations between Canada and the European Union are always being affected by what is happening around. And if it's such major partners like the United States and the European Union, it is heavily affected. And of course, it makes you sometimes feel powerless. You almost have the impression, how much room do we have here for maneuver? Are we ultimately forced basically to follow? And just to give you information, up-to-date information, this week, actually early this week in Switzerland, the industry now took the initiative to say, okay, our neighbors are negotiating TTIP. We have to get into it. We could have our own agreements, but ultimately maybe it simply means we have to join them in this agreement. We have to be part of the same agreement if we want then to be in this dynamic process. And that, of course, makes you a minor player in a game, which then also politically is quite difficult. And the very last thing, again, this regulatory cooperation, that's certainly the challenging thing for lawyers and economists to show how can this be done, what kind of institutions does it need, what kind of cooperation does it imply, and how can this be communicated also to the larger public, which has proved to be not so easy in the past as well. Thank you very much.